Okay, welcome everybody. This is the fourth panel series of unknown unknowns that we're running here on new economic issues at the Danube. This evening we have quite an interesting topic of discussion, whether it's time for a new global monetary order, as we'll see in the short presentation that I'll give. There are big things happening in the monetary system in the world at the moment that are being talked about a little bit, perhaps more than they were 2 or 3 years ago, but probably not sufficiently so. And I think the real question that we're facing shortly, given the mixed results, shall we say, of the Trump tariffs, is whether it might be time to discuss a new monetary order. So I'll just give a brief presentation on the current global trends in this regard so that everyone's aware of them, and then we'll turn over to a panel to discuss it. So really, to ask when all of it started, you could go back and back. It's like all these things in history, it's slightly arbitrary where you make the first cut. But in recent times, the shaking of the current global monetary system really started with the seizure of Russia's foreign exchange reserves just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. There's two exhibits, Exhibit A and Exhibit B, you might say. On my right, your right as well, is a Financial Times article just after the seizure of the Russian reserves. And it says there, officials in Moscow will be hard-pressed to halt the collapse in the ruble. The idea was that the seizure of these reserves would collapse the Russian ruble and send the Russian economy into a tailspin, collapsing the political system and so on. This was the initial plan to win the war. You'll see there also President Joe Biden's now infamous tweet, or it will be infamous by the end of all this, where he says, as a result of our unprecedented sanctions, the ruble was almost immediately reduced to rubble. The Russian economy is on track to be cut in half. I really would underlie what it means for an economy to be cut in half. I mean, even in a major depression, you're probably talking about a 20% decline in the economy. So these were pretty extreme predictions, I would have said. Everything did not go according to plan. There's a news article only a few months later, that's in June. The asset seizure occurred in late February, early March. And by June, you had CBS reporting the ruble is the strongest currency in the world this year. Oops, that was a bit of a mistake. A few people warned that the reserve seizure might just not work, but it also might destroy the hegemony of the US dollar, the status of the US dollar as a reserve currency. Some perhaps forgivable narcissism. I wrote an article in March of 2022, and Zoltán Pozsár, a Hungarian, I'll note, who used to work at Credit Suisse before it shut down, was also warning that the US dollar might lose its reserve status. There were other people behind the scenes. A lot of people at Goldman Sachs were chattering about this and so on, but it wasn't explicitly discussed very much at the beginning of all this. Vladimir Putin himself said something quite interesting in a speech that I'm sure will be picked over by historians in the future. I'll just read it. This was just after the reserve seizure. This was the beginning of March. The illegitimate freezing of some of the currency reserves of the Bank of Russia marks the end of the reliability of so-called first-class assets. In fact, the US and the EU have defaulted on their obligations to Russia. Now everybody knows that financial reserves can simply be stolen, and many countries in the immediate future may begin, I am sure that this will happen, to convert their paper and digital assets into real reserves of raw materials, land, food, gold, and other real assets, which will only result in more shortages in these markets. All things told, that turned out to be pretty good investment advice. If you'd listened to the Russian president in early March of 2022 and invested your portfolio in real assets, you would be flying pretty high right now. Gold soared, and it's not a mystery why gold soared. You can see there the gold price, and also an explanation for it. Central banks are hoarding gold like never before. What do they know that you don't? The massive build-up isn't driven by a single concern. It's a reaction to a converging set of global risks. The freezing of Russia's foreign reserves in response to the Ukraine war exposed the vulnerability of holding assets in Western currencies. The credibility of dollar reserve assets was based on the idea that they would not be defaulted on, and the seizure of Russian assets was really just a default. Putin is correct on that. You can say it's a justified default, you can say that Russia engaged in internationally criminal behavior, you can say all that, but at the end of the day it was a default on dollar assets, which is why in normal times it would have been considered beyond the pale and very dangerous from an American point of view. So, come up to the present time, enter Liberation Day. We just all lived through it. And what we've seen since Liberation Day is a massive acceleration in what you might call de-dollarization, or the collapse of the dollar, the potential collapse of the dollar as the global reserve currency. Yes, the gold price has been going up since the war, that's no doubt true, but a lot of the financial markets in the United States still look like they were functioning. I won't go too much into this, it's quite boring, but what the current data is showing since Liberation Day is that some aspects in the US financial markets are no longer functioning as they should if the US dollar is the global reserve currency. In technical terms, the negative correlation between stocks and bonds has broken down. When stocks go down, bonds tend to go down now. That means that if the US has a recession or a stock market crash, it can no longer borrow cheaply. That was the real privilege of the US dollar. I mean, there are a few others, trade balances and so on, but one of the privileges was cheap borrowing rates, a rush into US dollars anytime there was a crisis. Since Liberation Day, that is no longer the case. People are starting to notice things. Shortly, I think after Liberation Day, it may have been before, Stephen Moran, who's the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, gave a speech at the Hudson Institute in which he said, let me clarify that by reserve currency I mean all the international functions of the dollar, private savings and trade included. I've often used the example that when private agents, that's a little boring. As a result of this, the reserve currency, Americans have been paying for peace and prosperity, not just for themselves, but for non-Americans too. What is Moran saying? He's kind of saying that the reserve currency may have caused a lot of the problems, the economic problems in the United States, that it may have caused a lot of the trade imbalances and so on. When that speech was put up on the White House website, behind the scenes in financial markets, it caused an absolute earthquake. It was never really reported on. The incentives weren't there to report on it, but it really spooked people because people said, is it now White House policy to be against the reserve currency status? I note since then, Stephen Moran has spoken a lot less in public. But it's released the dragon in a sense. You can see this is from Project Syndicate, which is a big economics publication, King Dollar's Shaky Crown, questioning the credibility of the reserve currency and so on. The fact of the matter is that the idea that the US dollar might be ending its status as a reserve currency is no longer just espoused by fringe Irish and Hungarian economists. It's now actually semi-mainstream, which probably means that we're in the process of de-dollarization. It may be pretty close to decision time already. These are kind of technical indicators. The scatter plot there is the dollar index versus the 10-year Treasury inflation-protected security yield. And you can see that you have a very normal pattern, and then suddenly you don't have a normal pattern anymore. And what that signals is what I said earlier, that the borrowing rates of the US government are going up, in this case while the dollar goes down, and that's not usually been the case. In financial markets, that's translating to problems with what are called 60-40 portfolios. Those are equity bond portfolios that are supposed to balance you in terms of risk. When your bonds go down, your equities go up. When your equities go down, your bonds go up. And that correlation, as I said, has been broken, and so investment professionals are currently trying to figure out how to deal with that. But although that's only a concern really for pensioners and so on, that shows that the very significant structural dynamics are shifting in financial markets. So that's kind of why we're here today, that If this is true, if we're correct that the US dollar is losing its reserve currency status, then it could end up being a very chaotic unwinding. It could scale right up to a financial crisis that may trigger a US dollar crisis. That would create an awful lot of problems in the world, not just in the United States, in global financial markets and so on. So one of the proposals that we've put forward at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs is that the Trump administration should take this opportunity to create a new global monetary system, similar but not identical to the one that was put in place after World War II in 1944 at Bretton Woods, and that this, although it will allow the rebalancing that is probably required to take place, it will do so in a relatively managed way. So I think that's all. That's what we're going to discuss now. So I'll turn to our panel, who I will introduce, I think will be a good idea. So we have Professor James K. Galbraith from the University of Texas, Austin, an economist who has long experience in US government monetary policy and so on. We have Gladden Pappin, who's the president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, and we have Charles Yockey, who's a policy analyst at the Center for Legal Affairs and Constitutional Studies at the Manhattan Institute, and who I believe is also on the committee for Bretton Woods in Washington, D.C. at the moment. So I'll turn over to our panel now. Thank you very much. Is this working? Okay, perfect. So I think maybe we'll start with what a surprising or not a surprising moment this is. There've long been critical thinking, shall we say, on the US dollar as a reserve currency, but people who said that it might come to an end were genuinely thought of as slightly cranky gold bugs and so on. I suppose maybe I'll start with you, Professor Galbraith. Did you actually expect to see in such a recent time a discussion of the viability of the US dollar as a reserve currency?
Well, I think one has to keep an open mind about what is happening. We're clearly at the end of an era where there was essentially no alternative to the United States government bond, treasury bonds and bills as a reserve asset, and to the Washington institutions as the prime regulatory authorities of the world financial system. Let's say the fate of that system has been evolving for a long time since it was designed under entirely different conditions when the United States was a surplus country with industrial dominance, industrial and financial dominance, and none of that is true any longer and hasn't been for quite some time. What has been accelerating the prospects of change? A number of factors. The fact that the largest one is that the center of gravity of the world economy is has moved to Eurasia and specifically to China. And beyond that, the fact that American policy has in recent years moved to exclude certain important zones from transacting and basing their transactions on the Western financial system and specifically on the dollar, and thereby encouraging a non-dollar and also non-euro zone. This has been the sanctions policy to develop, and that shows a curious, very high and I think unjustified degree of confidence in the enduring power and non-replaceability of the dollar-based system. I will say though that I have some reservations about predicting imminent rapid decline or collapse because in order to build a replacement system, you have to have an alternative. And countries which have not been running current account deficits on a massive scale are not going to have a lot of their debt circulating in international markets, so that the architecture of an alternative system, not so much for trade settlements, which can be done relatively easily, but for reserves, is something which not only has to be designed, but it has to be accepted as a plausible long-term plan. It was the great genius of Keynes and also of Harry Dexter White in 1944 to have built a system that a great many people in the world community believed would last for a long time, and it did in fact last until 1971 and then became replaced de facto by a pure fiat dollar system, which has also lasted for 40 years. Coming up with a comparable system that will have the same level of credibility in the future it's a task which, Philip, I congratulate you for getting underway here and now, because it's going to take some work to bring it to fruition.
We'll see. We're at early stages right now. Gladden, what do you make of the rapid talk of de-dollarization? I mean, I know that we've discussed many times that you watched this debate play out over a few decades. Are you surprised that it's finally become mainstream?
Yes, it does seem to be changing rapidly, at least in the way that people are talking about it, and some of the market correlations that you pointed to are quite interesting as well. But as the political theorist on the panel, I will cease talking about economics from this point onward. I will only say that we've talked before about how for many of us who are around the age that Philip and I are, the 2008-2009 financial crisis was after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, the principal event that determined a lot of the shape of a lot of the world that we were growing up in and trying to make our way in professionally. I was in the university system at that time, and suddenly the academic world had lots of job searches available in the years before 2008, and suddenly after 2008 you saw all of the job searches go away, and in many other fields as well, a generation of young people felt that something was shaky. And so it was very compelling at the time for me and a lot of other people to read narratives which were available even then about the risk to the status of the U.S. dollar that the post-2008 quantitative easing programs posed. It didn't really happen at that time. As they say, the markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And so those of us who became gold bugs in 2009 have gone through a 15-year period of feeling that we were in the wilderness until things are finally moving in our direction. But I think for people who watched September 11th and then the 2008-2009 financial crisis and the economic consequences that unfolded after that, one of the areas of intellectual inquiry that was opened up by both of those events, as well as by the foreign policy decisions of the early 2000s administrations in the U.S., was what is it that underpins U.S. primacy? What is it that underpins the U.S.-led world order? And in what institutions is that order principally to be found? And that question, I think, is one we could open up. It has been given many different answers over the course of the life of U.S. dollar dominance. And you could say that in the latter years of that, very different answers were given from those in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. By the 1990s and the early 2000s, the answers given as to why the U.S. had global primacy in the world and the primacy of its financial institutions was no longer to be undergirded just by classical understandings of industrial strength, which were cementing its place at the head of the world order, both from a manufacturing point of view and from the trustworthiness and intrinsic value of its major institutions. But somehow, beginning in the post-Cold War era and then accelerating through the early 2000s, the answers to that question really began to change. Well, you don't need an underlying industrial economy. we can shift to a services-based economy. And our brilliance at financial services, that is what will underlie the perpetual dominance of the Western-led financial system. And so although we don't have the manufacturing strength anymore, no one else has the algorithms. We have the algorithms. We have the trading facilities. We have the banks with the big experience. And in many ways, the UK was kind of the pioneer in going in this trajectory. We don't need anything else other than financial services. Let's see how it turns out. And I think we can see that now. But in many ways, the same phenomenon happened with respect to U.S. primacy as well. The industrial base was gutted. The version of cultural and ideological strength or supremacy was changed. And now, somehow, through the events that you described that happened under the Biden administration, the hollowness of that became clear. So it seems that we can discuss the policy decisions later, but it seems that the direction that the Trump administration is trying to take is, can we both acknowledge that some terrible decisions were made during that period, some basically false bases of U.S. power were put forward, but can we take what we have and turn it back into something strong?
Charles, as the youngest member on the panel, I'd love to hear your take on it. You didn't have, I guess, as long a run of US dollar hegemony before Stephen Moran started questioning it on the White House website. What's your general take?
So I remember the first conversation we ever had when I moved here in August was actually about the primacy of the US dollar. And you said something that was very upsetting to me, which this wasn't a sure thing. And it really, kind of contradicted the orthodoxy I had been mirrored in studying these things in undergraduate and graduate school. And I made the case to you that because of the, kind of depth of U.S. capital markets, America's military and diplomatic reach, I didn't think in my lifetime we'd be questioning the primacy of the U.S. dollar. But, talking to you today, in like the 9 or 10 months that have elapsed, I think my thinking has substantially evolved. And I think what's really changed it has been that I underestimated how much global patience with dollar hegemony depended on confidence in like U.S. institutions and leadership, and also there's been like an unanticipated political shift in the United States as well, right? So those are the two factors that have kind of caused me to question that orthodoxy, but I think it's already happening, and anybody who denies it does so at their own peril.
So I think another interesting question, we will eventually get to the potential solutions. There'll be the MacGuffin, as Hitchcock would have said throughout the whole thing. But I think it's worth assessing this a little bit more. Obviously, I showed again Stephen Moran, the head of the chairman of the economic advisors, calling into question whether the reserve currency status of the dollar was a good thing. That is a very new opinion to see, definitely on the White House website, but even that question raised in financial media is a very new phenomenon. But there have long been critics of US dollar, strong dollar policy, reserve currency policy. Professor Galbraith, on balance, do you think that the US dollar hegemony, let's say since 1971, the fiat version of it, has been a net positive or a net negative?
Well, it depends on whose perspective you're taking. I would, first of all, date the fiat aspect of this from the arrival of Paul Volcker in 1979, which really, the steps that he took then were intended to shore up the dollar in face of the competition at the time from the Deutschmark and the Japanese yen. And, of course, the consequences were, first of all, success in that dimension, but enormous cost to the American industrial base and to the, particularly to the machinery industries of the upper Midwest region, which is still feeling the consequences of the deindustrialization of that period. At the same time, though, the system which emerged which my friend and colleague, and former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, has described as the global minotaur, in which the United States provided a kind of sink of demand for the industrial products of the rest of the world, was set up a process which fostered the development and industrialization of a great many of America's trading partners, which otherwise might not have had markets for everything that they were capable of producing. So against the negatives, you have positives, and you have a system which endures on the sufferance of the larger community with which the United States economy is engaged. And then the question is, will that sufferance continue? It has certain limitations. One of the major limitations is the periodic incidence of debt crises, austerity programs, the enforcement of its structural adjustment by the International Monetary Fund, effectively seen as an agent of the United States Treasury. And to the extent that countries come to realize, as many have, that this is an inherent limitation on economic development, they're going to look for other ways to sustain a growth and development process, and they're going to look for partners that are going to do so on more favorable terms, for who their interest lies in a different pattern of development. And the great difference in the world is that those partners now exist, potentially and actually. And there is absolutely no reason why major economies that 30 or 40 years ago, when they got into trouble, felt they had no choice but to accept the diktat of the Washington Consensus and the Washington institutions, and effectively of the US government, now have some bargaining power in the matter, in fact, quite a lot. And I would expect that the world economy will evolve in a, let's say, much more emollient manner if that process is allowed to develop it develops in a useful way.
Gladden, Professor Galbraith is just kind of, in the first part of his answer there, is talking about the link between deindustrialization and the US dollar reserve status, the status of the currency and so on. Do you think that, I wouldn't want to say that the MAGA movement has now completely embraced kind of de-dollarization, but I suppose I'd love to hear your thoughts on the fact that the de-dollarization program has come and it's kind of converged with the MAGA moment, and MAGA's concern is actually logically linked to the dollar policy. I mean, I'd kind of read that as the brains interpreting the will of the MAGA masses are trying to explain the problem and so on. But do you think it runs deeper than that, or what do you make of the de-dollarization as a political phenomenon?
Well, I'll come to that in a second. It's I think a quite delicate strategic question involving a lot of variables for the decision makers whose job I don't envy. But fundamentally, certainly growing up as a consumer in American society, you have the experience that dollar hegemony is great because every time you get on or off an airplane, you exit with like 3 to 5 new credit cards and the ability to like take free flights and rack up a ton of charges for very low interest rates. And when I came here and attempted to open a credit card account, I was told that I needed to come back with a certified in-person live translator to begin the months-long process of opening a credit card account, which in the end I never did. So this raises this points to a larger question when we talk about U.S. dollar hegemony or the strength of the dollar over the last 40 years. We're not just talking about something which affects the balances of global trade and holds the world together or creates imbalances, but we're also talking about a set of socio-cultural phenomena and related political aspects that were created during that time. Certainly for the world's largest economies, like for the US and China, the decision whether to accentuate the consumer side or the producer side is a strategic decision that is to some degree in the hands of maybe not a single decision maker, but a set of decision makers following that path over time. But evidently, as we can see now, and this is the strategic question or the sensitive or difficult situation, is the result that it creates from a political standpoint. Clearly now, the U.S. decision makers have concluded, since it was embedded into the MAGA movement, which is back for the second time, that the U.S. needs to be more of a producer economy. Well, that's a wonderful thing to say, and it should be, but navigating a large economy from being heavily consumption dependent to one in which more production can happen, it's clearly an imperative. It's the two-time imperative of the MAGA movement. It became even more obvious as a necessity in the last few years of the Ukraine war, when all sorts of critical components in the U.S. military supply chain were exposed as having risky dependencies. So it's clearly an imperative. But if you were to make a rash decision or to try to affect change too rapidly in a liberal democracy, you could undo the very political conditions that would enable you. So I think what we're seeing now is this. You can see in the president's communications that he's highlighting the strength of the U.S. consumer economy. On the other hand, the clear hope for the result of the policies is that eventually we'll get to a place where policy decisions pointing in a production direction can be successful. And this is the million-dollar question for Western liberal democracies, the U.S. in particular. Can they do that? Well, I mean, I think anyone who's lived for a long time in the U.S. can say, well, after a few decades of being able to open or having difficulty refusing credit cards, people are trying to hand them to you, like I said, the prospect of suddenly entering into a more restrictive consumer environment for the sake of production is something that's challenging for the short-termism of the modern mindset. So this, I think, is the hope of the second Trump administration this time, because of its huge political mandate, winning all the swing states, winning both houses of Congress, having a big mandate. It clearly has a window in which to try something. So we'll see whether it works, but I think this is the constraint that this form of economy is experiencing from a political standpoint.
Charles, what do you make of the capacity for Americans to shift away from consumption, especially younger Americans? I mean, when Gladden and I were young, it really was like consume, and I think people genuinely believed in it when we were probably kind of teenagers growing up, or in the 90s, early 2000s, but I'm not sure if I get that sense with younger people in America today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to, facilitate that type of lifestyle shift, period, but I wonder whether it's going to remain politically palatable. But, we think about, I think it's telling that in the run that we've had with this system, the majority of detractors have been non-American, and 44 was different than 71, but I think that de Gaulle, was correct when he called it an exorbitant privilege that, the American dollar would maintain this status, right? Because it seems that it allowed the U.S. to run persistent trade deficits without a run on the currency, borrow cheaply without exporting inflation. But I think the other kind of neglected element of this system was that it made Treasury securities so safe. It was like the de facto safe harbor for other countries to borrow against, right? And I think that's a geopolitical asset as much as an economic one, but it's also created dependency. And when other countries fund our deficits, we can avoid difficult choices. So I guess I don't lament the system that's been in place for the past 40 or even close to 80 years, but I do think that the moment has shifted, and a lot of that is going to depend on how well American consumers are able to adjust to the type of lifestyle decisions that Dr. Pappin is talking about. Is that going to be politically palatable to the American electorate is something I don't know, but Americans are used to their quality of life, and I think any hit to that is going to, that's going to be electorally tenuous?
Yeah, I'm going to say a few things that may be a bit uncomfortable. Had we not in the U.S. started down the path of financial dominance in the Reagan and Volcker era, then I think a strong industrial base could have been maintained for quite some time. But we did start down that path. And now the options that are open to this administration are somewhat constrained. I think that it is indeed possible to accelerate a process which is already underway to some extent of bringing manufacturing businesses from Europe to the United States. Why? Because the U.S. has, compared to, for the moment, Germany, a competitive environment for business investment for the American market. Automobiles is an example, and that's already happening. However, when you turn to the larger and the, let's say, technologically more recent industries, I don't think that's the situation. And specifically, when you think about advanced electronics and semiconductors, you're looking at an industry which has grown up on a global basis. It has some poles of strength in, let's say, most advanced design, lithography. That's the Netherlands and the United States. But it has materials for which China has a practical monopoly in the world market, and rare earths refining. And it has the fact that the market for these things, 50% of it, according to the US government a few years ago, is in China. And so breaking up that industry and turning it into a regional industry for some strategic purpose is not going to give you an industry that is going to be able to compete on the world market if you can make it work at all, which is also not clear because certain things have technologies which are not present or mastered in the United States and might be very difficult to install there. So it looks to me that if I were advising this administration, and I'm sure they will not ask for my advice, that they ought to really consider what the strategic imperatives and questions facing the United States actually are, and whether we couldn't construct a world in which we restore the productive forces to some degree in the United States by cutting back on the financial position of American elites in the world and on what is, I think, effectively a highly obsolescent military presence around the world, a military presence which essentially has been, as happens to militaries, has been overtaken by technological events, a fact which is evident to us on a daily basis. And yet, of course, we're extremely committed to a set of technologies, naval technologies, nuclear technologies, aircraft technologies, which no longer carry the clout that they carried for the first 50 years after the Second World War.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Gladden, I'd like to get your perspective on something, because there's been a very interesting political shift in the Republican Party, well, at least in the Trump movement. Obviously, there's been plenty of political shifts in the Trump movement, but one of the key political forces behind maintaining a strong dollar policy, basically US reserve currency hegemony, whatever you want to call it, was Wall Street. And right now, the Trump administration has a very unusual relationship with Wall Street. For one, we have pretty good evidence that most of Wall Street backed the opponent, Kamala Harris. Democrats seem to have become the party of Wall Street. And the Wall Street people who work in the Trump cabinet, Stephen Moran and Scott Bessent being the most visible, are clearly dissidents of some sort. So what do you make politically of this shift of the Trump movement away from the Wall Street nexus?
Yeah, I think that's clearly tied to ongoing shifts within the Republican Party itself. The previous consensus that the Republican Party exhibited was the kind of agreement between the neoliberal economic policies and the neoconservative foreign policies. And so a lot of, well, I'm thinking back to when I graduated from university 21 years ago. I think half of the graduating class of Harvard went into finance, with a large percentage of Republican type finance bros going to Wall Street. I also did, but don't hold it against me. And but the mood in the party has clearly shifted. You've got Scott Bessent saying that the U.S. economy is too much constructed like a barbell. I think one of the ends of the barbell is like super cheap day labor, and the other end is high finance and some high-end technology. And then the industries that used to prop up Main Street are basically gone. So the Trump phenomenon since 2016, represented by the president himself, is this sense of being a traitor to his class. He was disliked by all of the New York elite for exposing and undermining the reality of the world that they produced. And I think that the mood has matured a little bit in the second Trump administration. Again, you can agree or disagree about the policies. Maybe they're smart, maybe they're not, maybe they're effective, maybe they're not. But there's a fundamental question that the second Trump administration is asking about every major institution in American political life. I already called out Harvard once, and that's obviously one of the institutions on the menu. It's just a representative one. Wall Street is a representative one as well. And the question is, how does this institution serve American national interests? Does it serve American national interests? That's a preliminary question, but it's a question that many people in these institutions have not asked for a long time. Maybe some of these institutions were built during a period in which it could be taken for granted that their activity was going to serve the American national interest. But the ideological layer or the educational layer that was perpetuated during that 30 or 40 year period of time undermined that. So again, now I'm shifting from Wall Street to higher education, but you can bring it back to, it's clearly the same phenomenon. There was a professor from, I think, the Harvard History Department who said in response to Trump's attacks on Harvard, Harvard is a global institution that happens to be located in America. And this is clearly the sentiment that the globe-trotting financial elite have held for a long time. And somehow, some way, this was initially conceived as being at least coordinate with national interest. These institutions were sold to no one under the guise of ultimately harming America's role or weakening its position in the world. Even though they did. But that question is now being asked, and it seems that the only people on Wall Street who are attempting to answer it are basically the dissidents that you pointed to.
Charles, I'd love to get a sense in the young Republican milieu. Is finance as prestigious as it once was? I went into finance maybe in 2014 or something. I think it probably had lost a little bit of its shine when I went in, but maybe I could have attributed that to the 2008 crisis. Is it still very prestigious to graduate from a leading university and go into finance at the moment?
Well, I was going to be an investment banker, so I have a conflict of interest in answering this, but I think it's a really interesting question, actually. I don't think that it's less prestigious, but I also think that people can divorce their political viewpoints, I guess, from their professional interests, or that's something I've seen a lot more of. I don't know what it was like before, but among a lot of right-leaning people I know who were going into financial services, I think that they appreciate this shift, and can understand that the strong dollar policy served like the interest of global capital, and Wall Street liked it because it supported capital flows and asset prices, but they can also acknowledge that it hollowed out our industrial base. And I think that Trump has realigned economic policy away from abstract metrics and more towards the health of productive, domestic capacity. I think that's something that young people can appreciate. But I think there is a little bit of a tension that has to be worked out because, of course, high asset prices, necessarily go along with low interest rates. And I also think that some impulses of Trump's economic platform with the de-dollarization stuff is, of course, going to make borrowing much more expensive. So
it already has?
Already has. So there's, kind of an innate, I wouldn't call it contradiction, but tension, between those two forces. And I think to understand how young people, are thinking about, like the health of the nation and how those metrics are kind of different than the health of the financial economy, that question also really needs to be solved. But that's something I'm watching with great interest is how Trump's economic team ultimately comes down on that question, because you can't have it both ways. And I think that we're already seeing, inter-ecumenical squabbles within Trump's economic team around how to, deal with that. What's more important between those two factors?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Anyone who says that there's some one weird trick solution to this question is selling you magic beans. Really, it's a really difficult situation. But I think it is kind of, we're coming to the point where it has to be addressed. Just very quickly before we move on, James, what do you make of the fact that that Wall Street did swing toward the Democrat Party in the last election? I mean, everyone would have assumed after Obama's presidency was, I don't think it was actually an attack on Wall Street, but you could, if you were a Wall Street person, you could read it that way. The Obama administration at least made some friendly signals toward Occupy Wall Street and the protest movements and so on. And now in this election, or in the previous election, Wall Street has backed the Democrat Party candidate. I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
I'm not sure I quite followed the question, Philip. Can you just restate?
Just that
maybe put your microphone down so I can hear it freely.
The Democrats were backed by Wall Street in the Harris administration, whereas the Obama administration
of course,
as anti-Wall
yeah,
Street.
No, the Democratic Party has, and it's part of following the evolution of my alma mater, become or passed through perhaps a period of where its financial base is basically coastal. It's on the one hand the major Wall Street firms. This is the party of, after all, of Robert Rubin and his associates, and dominated Democratic financial policy for 30, 40 years. And on the other side, the technology sector, which is now moved over to align itself with the new administration, but was also a pillar of the Clinton-Obama period, and the shift in the political allegiance of the West Coast from the Republican to the Democratic Party, which happened from the 1980s into the 1990s. After all, Reagan was a California Republican, and that's that period has disappeared. Okay, so what's happening to the Democratic Party now from a financial standpoint? Now, the Wall Street element is still very important, but you also have a mass appeal to the professional classes. And essentially, I would argue that the Democratic Party has become a fundraising engine drawing on the urban professional classes to support a permanent campaign operation with essentially no strong agenda. And in fact, it's advantageous from a fundraising standpoint for the Democrats, for the Republicans to be in power, because they can then point to all the horrible things that are happening, which supports the shadow establishment of pollsters and public relations people. This can go on for quite some time. And the result of this is that the Democratic Party feels no great urge to re-examine the fundamental principles of its policy, no great urge to generate a set of leaders that make it to a new generation, but a set of leaders with fundamentally different attitudes, no great urge to challenge the foreign policy priorities that came to dominate the Biden years. And all of that discussion is now happening in the administration and the Republican Party, where there are considerable divisions and considerable discussion and struggles going on. And so you have to expect that innovation is going to happen where discussions and debates and real conflicts of interest are being resolved, and that's not happening in the Democratic Party. And I say that with a great deal of regret, because I am, I suppose, a high church Democrat. It's hard for me to imagine being, affiliated with any other political institution. It's bred in my bone going back to, my father's immigration from Canada in the 1930s in the Roosevelt era. And, you have to say it's a little disappointing to see such a enormous void of, let's say, independent thinking and challenging of the main assumptions that have governed and come to govern the Democratic Party in the period from Clinton to Obama and beyond.
So earlier at the beginning of the conversation, Professor Galbraith said that, quite rightly I think, that you can't really understand this moment of potential global monetary shift if you don't understand the changing geopolitical balance of power in the world, effectively what is now being called a transition from a unipolar world focused on the United States to a more multipolar world order. I don't even think I know really the answer to this question, but maybe Gladden, you could help me out. What has been, do you think, both the Trump administration and the Trump movement's reaction to the fact that debate about a potential loss of unipolar power is bubbling up to the surface, or do you think it hasn't yet? Do you think people are still pretty ignorant of this shift?
Well, I think these discussions evolve in a number of different layers within politics, and that's certainly been true of the MAGA movement. Right now, one of the simplest ways to describe the coalition on the right is that there's a coalition between the ordinary MAGA voters and the tech elite, the new right-wing tech elite. Alongside that, there has been developed over the last 4 to 8 years a much more sophisticated way of thinking among the policymakers on the right in Washington. So many of those who've gone into the Trump administration, Secretary Rubio being a principal example, along with his team, were pioneers of developing the policy way of thinking, which is now going into the new administration. So these are the elements of the movement. Or the political phenomenon. And this is always the case with political phenomena. I mean, it's the nature of democratic politics is that there's a constituency and political actors and intellectuals and strategists and so on and so forth. But that was not the case under the first Trump administration. That was really too new. So your question is, where does American primacy fit into this? Well, I think it's an open question, but what unites everyone is that they want the preconditions for American strength understood in their way or in this way to be restored or rebuilt as much as possible. If you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said maybe right after maybe 2 years ago or so, when it already looked as though the sanctions regimes were promoting or generating a new pole out of power outside of the West, I might have said that, well, it's too early for the MAGA movement to think about a multipolar world order. But actually, there's been, since the very beginning of the new Trump administration, I wouldn't call it a shift, but a maturation of the goal. And this became clear in Secretary Rubio's first interview, the very first weekend of the new administration, which he mentioned in passing, not emphasizing it too much, that America has to figure out how to compete again, or compete in a new way in a newly multipolar world order. And you've spent several years unpacking what that means on a certain podcast, so I won't attempt any kind of definition of that. Just sticking with the political phenomenon, I think this formulation, which Rubio put forward, is something that ordinary people can embrace. Everyone sees that U.S. prestige had been hit a lot, especially under the Biden administration, but in a deeper way, also through decisions by the neoconservatives over the years. And Trump openly talked about all of this on the campaign trail. He was very harshly critical about the situation that the United States had gotten itself into on the world stage. So it's much more sophisticated than tub thumping. This is not a tub thumping movement. It's the beginnings of a much more mature political movement. The only challenge is that the challenges are really big.
It strikes me as the case that the old way of thinking on kind of both sides of the political divide was highly relative. Like both sides were very concerned with American primacy, over rivals and maintaining, I suppose, a place of number one, whereas thinking on the new right is very dominated by, I guess, like an absolute assessment of certain metrics of power. And I think the emphasis on what metric that's, going to be has been the subject of intense debate, but I think that might be driving a lot of the thinking behind this political shift. I
have occasion from time to time to reflect on the advantages of having reached a great age, which I more or less have at this point. I'm old enough to remember and to understand that there's a dynamic in American domestic politics of increasing and ratcheting up hostility with respect to some foreign adversary, whether that was the Soviet Union in the 1950s or Iran in the 1980s. And now it's China. And one has a great difficulty running in American domestic politics against that current. But I'm also old enough to remember that it is a habit of American presidents to distinguish themselves with abrupt reversals in those policies. I'm old enough to remember that in 1971, Henry Kissinger went secretly to Beijing to meet Zhou Enlai, and in 1972, Richard Nixon went publicly to Beijing to meet Chairman Mao and to normalize relationship with China, and thereby to place the Vietnam War into, put it into history, basically bring it to a conclusion, because there was no longer any larger strategic purpose for it. And I'm old enough to remember, it doesn't have to be that old anymore, that the same Ronald Reagan who treated the Soviet Union as the evil empire, was the man who met Gorbachev in Reykjavik, and at the end of his term was strolling in Red Square with Nancy Reagan to celebrate the end of the Cold War, while the Soviet Union was still in existence at that time, of course. So I think one should be prepared for the kinds of developments which we, first of all, have already to some extent seen, as this president has tried to step back from the brink of a, let's say, overt and catastrophic confrontation with the Russian Federation. And I think we could possibly hope for a similar reduction of tensions with respect to China. Now, the Communist Party has been running China since 1949, after all. It's not a new thing from a standpoint of every other part of the world. It's simply a phenomenon which has got a considerable amount of staying power and will have to be dealt with in the future as a let's say, a strong and very likely enduring feature of the economic and political scene. The more that we can do that on a peaceful basis, the better the chance that we have of dealing with other problems that the planet faces.
Yeah, I think this is actually ultimately the question that's facing us. The monetary system itself is a technocratic system. You've probably noticed we haven't discussed it much today. There is a paper out from the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. I'm the author of it. You're free to read it. It's a technical way of how the system would run. But ultimately, like the original Bretton Woods, this is going to be a political settlement. The settlement in 1944 was to end the war and to try and put to bed many of the economic disruptions in the interwar period, hyperinflation in Germany, depression in the 30s and so on, trade war, sound familiar, tried to put those things to bed and build a prosperous future for at least the Western world. There was actually debates about whether to bring the Soviet Union in. They were ultimately not allowed into the Bretton Woods system. Interesting thought experiment to think what would have happened if they were. But it gave us, quite a few years of prosperity, and it gave us a time of global peace. So the question of a new Bretton Woods, the question of a new monetary system, is just as much a question of rebalancing the world and trying to contain some of the conflicts and try and put us on a path to create a prosperous and stable world moving into the future. Gladden, what do you think about the prospects for that? Do you agree with Professor Galbraith that it's quite typical for even administrations that are elected or begin their term with a very hawkish stance to kind of bring down those barriers a little bit as the global realities come through? Do you maybe see how do you evaluate the meeting in Switzerland to take down the tariffs? Do you think that that's just a once-off, or is that part of a new kind of tete-a-tete between the Trump administration and China?
Well, sometimes one forgets that we're only a few months into the new Trump administration. And
a lot has happened.
Yeah, a lot has happened, and we're always bringing up these questions that are like 10 or 20-year level strategic questions, maybe even more. And that, I think, is the fundamental challenge now that the world system has been built for minor tweaks and changes, and yet it has allowed some pretty big discrepancies or problems to creep up within it. And a lot will actually depend upon the intellectual and political framework that we create or use in order to pave the way for a new set of policy choices. I'm speaking at a really abstract level, so hopefully we can get into talking about some of the monetary architecture ideas that you guys have had. But just speaking about frameworks for a minute, the main question that has been used to drive the growth of liberal international institutions in the last number of years has been to oppose the rationality of global, or at least in the case of the EU, large regional structures against the irrationality and dangers of national level decision making. Now, it's more complicated than that. Most of the free trade agreements that nations entered into were not sold as things that would damage the livelihood of their peoples, but would increase it. Everyone thought that they were going to get richer in the US through a permanent shift to financial services and the internet economy, and everyone could just retrain themselves as programmers, and then that would be replaced by AI programmers, whatever. So, but now it seems that the question now is if we're entering into an era in which national interests are again going to be primary or more pronounced, then what sort of global architecture is coordinate with that? The system that we've been living in, again, still maybe speaking too abstractly, but the system that we've been living in has conditioned us to think that the pursuit of national interests will always lead to a more destructive international order, will always ultimately cause more conflict than it prevents or avoids. The irony of the present system, the one that has been constructed around the liberal internationalist institutions, is that it has led to huge internal fissures within countries. It's made, in particular, the countries of Western Europe internally divided as a result of our migration policies, economically divided for the same reasons, militarily hobbled, due in part to lifestyle and cultural choices, and in part due to the fact that the societies themselves have withered away from the standpoint of unity, and therefore no one wants to fight and die for them. These are all the set of problems that have come about in significant part due to the nature of this liberal international framework. The question is, can there be a more rational international framework that still encompasses or is premised upon states pursuing their own national interests? Right now, with the Trump administration pursuing a more national interest approach in its trade and tariff policies. The question is how other states will respond, who will be left to defend the existing international architecture, or is it possible to have to marry the pursuit of national interest, or at least decision-making that's framed primarily around national interests rather than the perpetuation of international institutions? Can we have that and also have an orderly world result? And that, I mean, I don't want to give away some of what we've been talking about, but it seems that some of the monetary architecture that we've been hinting at would point in that direction.
Yeah, we'll remain hinting at it because it is a very technical issue, and I'd encourage you to read the paper. James, you wanted to come?
Yeah, I want to come back to this question of the evolution of the global financial architecture and the mechanisms for balancing out imbalances in trade flows. Because it seems to me that what we saw develop in the period after 1980 was a system which facilitated short-term capital movements and which imposed adjustment on countries that were facing debt problems in the face of interest rate environments that they did not control, through processes of austerity and so-called structural adjustment, which meant effectively curtailing public investment, public services, and reversing any process of economic development that is underway. And there are alternatives. And the alternative balancing mechanism, of course, Keynes proposed one which was essentially a liberal market idea, that you could basically maintain current account balances by adjusting exchange rates in an orderly way, and that did not prove to be in the long run a successful strategy. It doesn't take account of the fact that certain countries, Japan and now China, have structural surpluses, structural competitive advantages. So an alternative adjustment mechanism, which you've, I think, have written about, Philip, was to do this with essentially long-term foreign direct investment, to bring a country which is in a deficit position to a higher level of development by investing in its infrastructure, by investing in its ports, its harbors, its railroads, its airfields, its educational institutions, its healthcare system, in ways which are not designed to bring substantial financial returns, but are essentially designed to provide an offset for the surpluses that a country that has very low costs and highly competitive industry can earn in a relatively open trading environment. And that's a more attractive model than the neoliberal financial model, in which you basically borrow the money and pay it back until you can't pay it back anymore, a model which produced the aftermath of the Versailles Treaty and then the war period. Then it produced the first debt crisis in Latin America and elsewhere in the 1980s, contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, and the Asian crisis in 1997. And there's a lot part of the world that says we really don't particularly care to be enmeshed in repeated financial crises. And if you can design something which gives you a longer-term stable trajectory toward general prosperity, we'll go with that system instead. And I would suggest that from the standpoint of the United States, being involved in changing your mind about how you should proceed on these matters would be a very sensible thing, because it would engage you with a viable path that the rest of the world may find attractive to take in any event.
Yeah, just to summarize that again, we won't get too much into the technicals of the plan, but that you've pretty much hit on the absolute core question. The two ways that the United States can adjust its current balances can be either by currency, whether that's managed or unmanaged. The Bretton Woods system would try and manage that, as they did in post-1944. And that can work, but sometimes it doesn't work, and there are good reasons to think that it probably wouldn't work fully in the United States today. It's also quite painful because having a weaker and weaker dollar every year, you can imagine that there's a good deal of pain there. The other option is to convert effectively the Chinese inflows from going into bonds and equities, as James says, from basically financing your financial economy, financialized economy, to come in as FDI inflows. Yes, some of that can be low or no profit, but it could also be a BYD factory. We have one in Sigurd now being built. It could be a Chinese electronic vehicle factory or anything like that. That, of course, raises the key political question, which I think you're about to anticipate.
I'll just add to that, of course, I've been making a reference to the Chinese initiatives, the Belt and Road, but they didn't invent this. There are precedents for it. The Marshall Plan is a precedent for it. And before that, the British Victorians understood this. So those of us who were raised on the movie Mary Poppins remember this great scene. Railways through Africa, dams across the Nile. This was what the 19th century
Mary Poppins
understood very well. And I think in the end, they didn't make a whole lot of money off those adventures.
But it obviously raises, so this raises the big political issue, and I think it is, we may as well be frank here, because none of us are working for the Trump administration. This is the big political issue that's going to face the Trump administration if they're in any way interested in pursuing this. They will have to, first of all, at least open their minds to some sort of an infrastructure program, although, as I said, it could be private sector investment too. But even if it's just private sector investment, they'd have to open their minds to Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States. That is, building actual factories that Americans work at. So just like BYD's building a factory here. Maybe, Gladden, I'll throw that to you first. I mean, you're pretty familiar with the securitization of these discussions in the US, but there's nuance to that, right? Trump has consistently made overtures that they should build the factories here, and there's also, I know Elon Musk is very interested in having partnerships with Chinese EVs. How, at a kind of high level, how do you view the political discourse around that? Is it movable, I guess?
I don't know. Again, I think it's still at a very early point in the administration, so we'll have to see what the results of the current tariff policies are, or what kind of agreements that leads to.
Charles, what do you make of that? I think in the past, before this is kind of the irony of MAGA, before the MAGA movement came along, I think people wouldn't have had a terrible amount of problem with FDI inflows. The Japanese were building factories in the United States in the 1980s and so on. Well, do you think that the MAGA moment has ingrained resistance to that, or do you think it's flexible?
I do, because I think that a lot of the rhetoric around the reindustrialization project is kind of this idea that we'll go it our own way, right? They don't understand that that requires capital inflows. Where do we get that? China's a good provider. I think there's also a question of whether the flow of capital is regulated very strictly outside of China. It's not as if the state doesn't have a tremendous amount of influence over the foreign direct investments that their state-owned investment funds, et cetera, concede. So I think there's a question on that side of things as well. But just going back to the dollar dominance point, for a minute, I think that China sees the dollar's dominance as both a threat and a vulnerability, because clearly its export model relies on dollar-based trade, right? So they do walk a little bit of a tightrope, because, I think they want to erode dollar centrality without triggering a financial crisis that would hurt them as well. So there's this long-term desire for like a multipolar monetary system. Maybe foreign direct investment could, potentially help facilitate that if they can overcome their own political inertia. And, the MAGA movement is amenable to that. But I think that this is where rhetoric, both domestically and internationally, is actually kind of constraining certain political outcomes that people want. And there's great tension on both sides. But I think also you can't underestimate the fact that China clearly resents the dollar's role in enforcing sanctions and funding the U.S. military's presence in Asia. But it also holds trillions of dollars of assets, right? Even if it's been trying to shift that into gold, that sort of shift doesn't happen overnight. But on the U.S. side of things, I think there would be great resistance, especially from the base who have some notion of, this idea of like economic independence. I think that the idea of accepting, ceding from the Chinese to reindustrialize isn't intuitive. And I think that you would run into a lot of political opposition unless a very long off-ramp was built to kind of familiarize and, get people to buy into it.
I think the point you raise on the Chinese side is absolutely key as well. The Chinese business model, it relies a lot less on US dollar dominance as it did during the 2000s when it was running, I think, an 8% trade surplus or something around that, an enormous trade surplus. China's not as reliant on trade surpluses with the United States anymore. It's diversified its trade basket and so on. But it's about 2%. US exports to China are about 2% of Chinese GDP. So if they wound that down over the course of 3 years, it would significantly hit their growth target. Significantly, maybe significantly. But it wouldn't be particularly pleasant. It's definitely that 2% or 2.4% of GDP is baked into the Chinese growth model. They don't like messing with things that work. It would have dynamic effects because those sectors would lose out in investment and so on. But I think you're right. There's a dual understanding of the dollar's hegemony. They're not fans of it, as you said, for its use as a geostrategic tool, which I would argue is not particularly good for the dollar itself. But they are kind of implicitly in favour in it insofar as it keeps the exports rolling. James, I think this speaks to the really final question before we turn it over to the audience, which is something that we discussed last night. The Chinese would lose something from this. It would lose the undervalued renminbi. I mean, it's debatable whether it is undervalued, but it would lose the low value renminbi and the massive trade surpluses that it runs with the United States. Do you think, in order to get something like this over the line, it would have to be some sort of grand geopolitical bargain, and what do you think that would look like?
Do I think there needs to be a grand bargain?
For the Chinese to accept losing their massive trade surplus.
To accept
the Chinese losing their large trade surplus with the United States over time?
I don't know that China needs a large trade surplus with the United States. There are, at this point, quite well-established parts of the Chinese business sector which have long relied on the American market. But there are very large parts and more rapidly growing and more dynamic parts that sell to the whole world economy. So what the Chinese got out of the United States, and I say this as someone who at one point many years ago had a consulting position as an advisor to the State Planning Commission in Beijing in the 1990s. What the Chinese got from the relationship to Western markets was standards. They got the ability to, the discipline to produce to certain standards of quality, which was a problem that was not effectively solved by socialism in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. But the Chinese solved it. And they solved it by saying if you can sell to Target or Kmart or Walmart or to the American, the European market, then you can, of course, sell to the Chinese market the same goods, and the quality goes up. And this provided a competitive discipline. I think this is the most important thing. It's not being able, the money is useful, but this is the contribution that contact with the West made to Chinese in development of the consumer goods market and later, other kinds of industrial products in China. So this is a valuable thing, but it's a problem that's been solved. The Chinese market is no longer a low-quality market. It's a market of a vast market of sophisticated consumers with money to spend and the ability to impose that discipline and its own internal regulatory structures, which were not there 30 years ago, I'm sure. They're obviously much stronger now. Building codes, engineering codes, everything has moved from the middle to the front of the edge of global development. So can the Chinese adjust to a changing pattern of trade relations with the U.S.? Yeah, sure. And in fact, what happened in the initial phase of confrontation with the extremely high tariffs is that the U.S. said, we're imposing these tough tariffs, and the Chinese said, fine, we don't care. We'll match you. And of course, that means that Boeing will take a hit and other things that you care about. And after a little bit of reflection, the Treasury Secretary went to Geneva, and they drafted a joint statement, and the Chinese said, if you want to back off, we'll back off too, that's fine. If you do it, we'll do it. If you back off, we'll back off, that's fine. They didn't respond vindictively or with a feeling that they were being hurt. They knew what, on which side of the toast the butter was at this point. And I'll give the administration credit. They responded to that. And there's a much better chance of coming to an agreement that is long-term stable with China as a result of that interaction. There's a learning process that goes on here. So I wasn't at all discouraged by the overall evolution of events, although I must say when the tariffs first went on and we learned that the shipments from China were being cut by a factor of 2/3 in April, and you could imagine what was going to happen to distribution networks in the United States when those goods did not arrive on the shelves, and then some of that may still happen, may be happening. That was an extremely interesting, intense moment. But it didn't get to the point where the damage was irreparable. And with some luck, it won't get to that point.
Yeah, I think the Trump administration should be given credit for taking the flak. For taking the flak for so-called chickening out when, look, it took a really practical stance on the issue, which actually, I think, as Jim says, it bodes really well for future discussions around getting the global economy rebalanced. We're already up on time, but we started a little bit late, so I think we could take a question or two, if anyone's interested. Lots of people interested. Number one.
Industry and manufacturing needs a foreseeable future. There's less volatility, the more correct assumption about the future to make calculation of several years. So it can be a manufacturing boom when the outside parameters are changing so quickly, or can be a calculation of an investment when there is you don't know taxes, you don't know inflation, you don't know the markets. A rational decision maker what can do in this era. And just one moment, one example that John Deere has just announced that they will stop the production in the U.S. What do you think about it?
This is what the proposing a new global monetary architecture sorts out. The disruptions that you're describing to markets, to businesses' capacities to plan, stock shelves, build factories and so on. That's what trade wars do. They completely upend the certainty that businesses face, and that causes absolute chaos. That's one of the things that trade wars do. The stock market, since the Trump administration has taken office, is basically trading on White House statements. I saw recently that macro hedge funds are not doing well this year because it's borderline impossible to trade White House statements. So I think actually those pressures on both the business community from what you're describing, the inability to plan for inputs, for inflation, for taxes and so on, and then on the financial community, this uncertainty that the trade wars, it's not even uncertainty, the trade wars just come to completely dominate the financial markets. I think that actually provides a really big opening to have a discussion about a more stable system. A new Bretton Woods system wouldn't be ideal for Wall Street because it would close capital flows, and it would mean that Wall Street would probably have to shrink as an industry. That'll probably happen anyway, even if they allow the thing to adjust chaotically. But I think what you could explain to people on Wall Street is, yes, your industry will shrink, but you won't be trading White House statements until trading White House statements is like circling the drain, and eventually you go down the drain. That's kind of my view. Does anyone else?
Let me make a point, which is, something that's interested me is how the 1930s are used as an analog in our current trade discourse. But I think a big difference between today and then is when countries tried to use these measures to protect domestic industries, they had domestic industries to actually protect, right? Whereas today, it's like we're kind of lifting the drawbridge when there isn't something to protect. And, one area I think the Trump administration really needs to heed is the fact that going through these rituals aren't going to bring back industry because they serve fundamentally different purposes. That's not to say there isn't, merit to reindustrialization, but I think that the tariffs didn't fail entirely, but I think they were undermined by two things. One is resistance within the U.S. bureaucracy and a lack of structural reform in China. Like, tariffs can't fix the currency misalignment. IP theft, geopolitical rivalry, they're a tool, not a strategy. And, the global system is also still built to punish countries that defend their own industries to the extent that they exist. So, I don't know, that's kind of my take on the shortcomings of the tariffs to achieve certain policy goals, but I would partially defend them. I don't think they were wholly misguided.
I'm not sure how responsive this is to the question, but the observation I would make is that we've come through a period in which the economics profession, speaking to governments around the world and converting many of them, has argued that there was a single, let's say, best model for economic and social development. And that period's finished. That period is finished. We are going to have to adjust, we, the United States, the West, if you like, whoever you might be thinking of, to a world in which major sovereign forces make their own decisions about how they wish to run their affairs. And of course, the leading example of that is of course, China, but it's true of other major countries. It's certainly true of the Russian Federation, true of Brazil at this point, true of India. And, the fact is that the authority that the economics profession had from the 1970s through to, let's say, 2008, to say otherwise, to say you really need to go through a certain set of transitions toward, this is a word that was used, it became instantly applied to Eastern Europe in the 1990s. Transition to what? Transition to a liberal democratic model with free markets, yada, yada, deregulation, privatization, and so on and so forth. And, the fact is, that hasn't worked out all that well, and there are certainly alternatives which are competitive to it, and countries are going to pursue those alternatives as they see fit. And we need to develop a world that can adjust to that reality.
We'll do one more. It's getting past my bedtime.
Thank you very much, Gabor Sor, Secretary General of UNESCO Commission in Hungary. I'm really emboldened by your larger take on the developments in a more tectonic sense, and go back to Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln, to UNESCO Constitution and AI. You know this better. Lincoln said that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. What if this promise was not just national but planetary? As you said that now nations may again stand against each other, would multilateralism have a balancing role in that? And if you look at the current administration's take on multilateralism, that's not very promising. UNESCO in 1945 was born in the same wave than the Bretton Woods institutions. And the Constitution, first sentence says, since wars begin in the minds of people, it's in the minds of people that defenses of peace must be constructed. What if that war is not only between people, but between people with each other, wars, between people and nature, biodiversity degradation, climate change, and currently a new front line is emerging between humans and machine. I am not painting apocalyptic pictures of that, but there can be, if you add that complexity to the picture with the possible evolution, but already ready killer robots and other military uses of AI, you would have a gloomy outlook. Well, I would not advocate, I would certainly warn against that and rather propose an ethical use of AI by which we could, in a civic acts of responsibility, we could prompt AI in a positive direction, which is, it's a neural field, it's a neural network that is in AI, just as in our brain. So it is possible to flexibly change it, even if it was not made for that purpose. So rather than mourning, machines mourning at our grave, at nation's grave, and even at our humanity's grave, I would, and looking for the flowers that have gone, I would really hope that this new financial and political architecture that is being built now would somehow accommodate all the diverging needs and all the diverging aspirations. Thank you very much.
I'd like to comment on that. The initial Bretton Woods proposal, the one that Keynes put forward, not the one that was eventually actualized, although the US-based dollar system, the actual Bretton Woods system that we got, was somewhat the same. It wasn't, the Bretton Woods system was not really what we'd call today a globalist system. It may appear that way because there's a unit of currency that it uses, a fictional virtual currency that's used to settle trade balances. And I can see immediately how people would hop on that and say, you're promoting a global currency, everyone's going to have the Bancor, as it's called, in their pocket. It's not that. It's a global trade settlement mechanism. It's actually very similar to what's going on today. It's just a bit more managed. I won't get into the technical details. But the spirit of the Keynesian Bretton Woods system, the Bancor system, I don't think was particularly, as I said, what we call today globalist. It was actually set up for nation states and even collections of nation states. You can actually read in the initial drafts that he had in mind entities like BRICS and so on, that these collections of nation states, could be the EU, could be BRICS, could be anybody else, or nation states themselves, would just navigate the trade imbalances among themselves. So rather, the Bretton Woods system, to my mind, or a new Bretton Woods system, would be a rules-based system in which nations participate. It would not be some global dominance system to impose a single currency or a single set of really rigid rules on people or anything like that. It's not really about that. And I think, broadly speaking, my feeling is anyway, the idea that the nation state was going to go away, which many people had in the 1990s especially, is dead. The nation state's not going away. It's just, that did not work at all. And Professor Galbraith just said that some of the developing powers, the ones that were at least nominally communist, who were supposed to erase these national differences, have become some of the most nation-y nations around. So what we need is a system that can actually respect the sovereignty and integrity of nations and manage the conflicts between them. I think that's probably what you're saying, without them becoming this kind of ultra-federalist, ultra-globalist architecture, which just does not work, and there's absolutely no electoral desire for it at the moment. And the challenge, I think, for the Trump administration, for the nascent nationalist movements, is to find a way to communicate that to people. That nationalism or returning to the nation state or anything like that isn't actually a zero-sum game about conflict. It's you have to build a world in which nations are allowed to exist. That's my personal feelings on it. Would anyone else want? James?
Yeah. I would respond in the following way. The system that was set up in 1945 was a choice between two alternatives, not entirely incompatible, but they were different. What Keynes wanted to achieve was a system that would protect the capacity of a smaller country, the United Kingdom, to promote and pursue a policy of sustained full employment and in economic industrial development. What White and the United States wanted to achieve was a system which was centered on the United States and which would gradually liquidate the British Empire. So these were, as I say, there was a compromise to some degree between these two things, but they went forward on the basis of a discussion between those ideas. What emerged in the 1980s and 90s, and which was embodied in the European Union, was a set of ideas that were essentially neoliberal or ordoliberal, involved imposing a set of rules on a conglomeration of countries. It's a common currency, a central bank with a charter, unlike the charter of the United States Federal Reserve, that said you can only worry about inflation. I helped to write the enabling charter in 1978 of the Federal Reserve, the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. The Federal Reserve is not a inflation-only institution. It has multiple objectives, and it's responsible to the U.S. Congress nominally to pursue those objectives. So it is not on the same principles as the European Union. The notion of a free trade area, the notions of essentially managing the commercial relationships, but without having a central welfare system. This is the architecture of the economics profession as it was in the 1970s and 1980s. And the world going forward is not going to be built on that basis. It's simply not. It's not going to be. You're not going to sell that to large parts of the world that are making independent decisions. So I would argue that going forward, thinking about how to build a world system, you have to bring the major players to the table on the basis of a common security arrangement so that they're not at each other's throats and building toward warfare, and say, how do we make this work so that we can all live with a system and continue to pursue our own economic and developmental governmental models. When Richard Nixon went to China, it wasn't to convert the Chinese to capitalism. It was for an entirely different purpose, quite apart from securing his own re-election. It was to stabilize and in fact, to change the balance of power on the Eurasian continent, which he succeeded in doing. So, in some sense, one has to respect the choices that equal partners are making.
Any closing comments on that? Okay. Well, we're about 15 minutes over, but I think we get it since we started late. Thank you very much to all our speakers. That was a fantastic panel, and thank you everybody for coming.